Welcome to the Contemplative Science Podcast. My name is Jamie, and as always, I'm joined by co-host Dr. Mark Miller. Mark, how are you, man?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Today, our guest is John Vervaeke. John is an award-winning professor at the University of Toronto who specializes in psychology, cognitive science, and Buddhist psychology. His lectures and talks on YouTube regularly garner tens of thousands of views, and he is a leading voice on what he describes as the crisis of meaning. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. John Vervaeke. John, thanks for coming on, mate.
Thank you, Jamie, and a great pleasure to see you again, Mark.
Yes, always a pleasure to be talking with you like this, John. It's cool, there's a little bit of a reciprocity here. I got to come on your show not too long ago, and we're just thrilled to have you coming on our podcast as well.
Yeah.
So, we're interested mostly today in the crisis of meaning. And to jump straight in, can you characterize what you mean when you're talking about the crisis of meaning?
So when I'm talking about the meaning crisis, what I mean is there's sort of multiple ways of getting into what I mean, because it's a convergence of a set of themes. One is this idea that human beings seek and in some ways are constituted by what's now in psychology called meaning in life. This is a sense of being sort of fundamentally connected to themselves, especially through their lived bodies, other people, and the world. And this connectedness, I would argue, is the result of, or an expression of, a kind of dynamic, self-organized coupling between us and the world. The basic idea is a process I call relevance realization. We are confronted with overwhelming amounts of information in the world, in our mind, and in the sequences of behaviors and actions we can generate. And what we do is something analogous to evolution. We sort of introduce variation and then selection on it. So let me give you an example. You're doing it right now with your attention. Part of your attention wants to wander away and do this and adds all kinds of variations and makes weird connections. What about my laundry? Right? And then another part puts selective pressure on and brings you back in. And what you're doing is just like evolution. You're varying what's salient to you, right? And then selecting it. And so you're constantly evolving your salience. And when things are standing out in the right way to you and you are oriented in the right way to them, you feel connected. You feel here. You feel presence. You feel that things are real, that you're somehow mattering and things are mattering to you. All of that is really central to you being a cognitive agent. But, right, you can think about it this way. The very processes that make you adaptive also make you perennially prone to self-deceptive behavior. For example, that evolution of my attention means I'm ignoring most of the environment a lot of the time. I'm ignoring most of what's going on in my mind most of the time. And that is also a source of tremendous ongoing source of bias for me. I miss things, I prejudge things, I misjudge things, I misapprehend them. So cultures across time have developed practices, and especially what I call ecologies of practices, for intervening in that foolishness, that self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior, and trying to enhance the connectedness. And I would call the result of that, in which we get kind of an optimal grip on the world, I would call those sets of practices wisdom. And here's a way of putting it now, what the meaning crisis is, one aspect of it. We know where to go for information. In fact, we suffer from too much of it. T.S. Eliot's, we're distracted from distraction by distraction, right? And we kind of know, although we're now we're falling into a bit of a problem of where to go for knowledge. We have science and history, things like that, art and literature for more personal kinds of knowledge, right? But when I ask you, and I do this with my students all the time, where do you go for wisdom? Where do you go to train an ecology of practices within a homing community, within an even deeper homing tradition that allows you to ameliorate self-deception and afford that connection? And when we put those two together, flourishing, where do you go where you have plausible reason to believe you have a reliable way of life for flourishing? And most people are silent. They don't know. And here's the maybe in one sentence: wisdom is not optional. You're either cultivating it explicitly, powerfully, or you're doing it implicitly and haphazardly. And most people are doing the latter, and they try to cobble together little bits and pieces of spiritual practices, etc. And a lot of this suffers from autodidactism. It's very egocentric, and so you see the symptoms throughout our culture. You see increase in suicide, mental health issues, a loneliness epidemic, addiction epidemic. You have the virtual exodus where people are preferring the virtual world rather than the real world. You also see positive response, and I have criticisms of these too, but you can see the mindfulness revolution, the revival of Stoicism, all of these emerging communities of emerging practices, dialogical practices, mindfulness practices, movement practices. All of this is like the symptomology, as Chris Master Pietro and I say, of the meaning crisis. And it's getting worse, and COVID has made it worse. I'll shut up so you can say something. Sorry. I did a 50-hour series on this, and I'm trying to collapse it into 3 minutes.
No, I appreciate you collapsing it into 3 minutes. There's a couple of things, right? So the first thing is, it sounds almost anti-evolutionary when you put it like that. Like, it's an active, in some cases, attainment of wisdom, because otherwise our attention would just be so divorced from what it should be. Do you think of it as anti-evolutionarily?
The meaning crisis? I think the processes by which relevance realization occur are evolutionary processes, but evolution is not teleological. It's not working towards some perfection. And insofar as we are oriented as personal agents towards what's true, good, and beautiful, we can't depend on just the evolutionary prerogative to get us to the goals that we want. Evolution can take creatures into all kinds of dead ends. And in fact, it eventually kills off everything, right? Then every species go extinct. So it's not anti-evolutionary in the sense of denying the reality of it. In fact, what it says is, no, let's really understand the reality of this, and then let's try to work with it as best we can.
Yeah, right. So it's got worse because of COVID, you've said. But
Yes.
has this got worse than 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 500 years ago? Has there been a slope of decline?
I think it starts. I argue that it sort of starts in the 12th century, and then you get an acceleration of features. It depends how you measure. I would say, like the Battle of Kursk in World War II is a real high point, or the low point, if you want to put it that way, of the meaning crisis, because millions of men are dying in a titanic struggle. But what's happening right now is, the meaning crisis. Another way of thinking of meaning is it gives us a sense of being at home in the world in a really profound sense. And what happens when you're in a meaning crisis, you have what Porteous and Smith, Brian Walsh, call domicide. You don't feel at home anywhere. And COVID really accelerated that for people. Their sense of being at home was eroded, and it really magnified. And you're seeing another symptom of the meaning crisis because of COVID, the great resignation. People are refusing to go back to work. They're refusing. They're willing to take a hit to their standard of living because they want to go back to a more meaningful existence than the one they had pre-COVID, right? This is the kind of thing.
That's very interesting. So is part of what's at play there, you said that meaning is about being able to selectively sample those relevant features. And
Yeah.
I love that there's this perennial problem, which is that's really hard. It's super
Yes.
hard to select the relevant features. And one of the problems with our some of our modern developments is that they're not only exacerbating the amount of data that we have available to us, but they're actively drawing us away from what would be meaningful. So we're collapsing on what is meaningful, and then COVID asks us to do something totally different. Now we're stuck at home. All of the meaning structures that we had built, they start eroding. But could there possibly be a benefit there too, insofar as I think you just said, I think you tipped your hand a little, we get small, almost like we're going on retreat. And some of those maybe maladjusted meaning structures, they start to dissolve, and now you have a sort of an open territory to do something new.
Yes, I think that's well said. I think there's something analogous to what can happen individually, only analogous, but a good analogy to what happens in meditation, where you sort of pull out of all of these running structures, you reflect on them, and they become more opaque to you rather than transparent. And then you can start to say, hey, wait, those structures tend to lead me off. I would add a third dimension, Mark. It's not only that we're shifted, I think a lot of, and this is not just my theme, this is another symptom of the meaning crisis, a responsible one. Many people are pointing it to how our sense-making machinery is being corrupted.
Right.
I pointed out that as COVID was beginning that this was going to trigger. Think about the sort of phenomenological structure. You're cut off, you're isolated, you have to live by a really strict purity code, and then there's this ubiquitous, non-visible threat around you at all time. People were going to fall into mythological frames of mind, and conspiracy theories were going to take off and explode. And of course, the internet was already there seeding this, and those two things just, ramified off each other, and we got the massive explosions. I mean, it's so much so. I mean, there's a lot of other factors here, right? I'm not saying this is the only factor, but I'm saying it's a contributing factor. And this is no longer a ridiculous thing to say, we may be seeing the ending of the United States as a political entity. And to think of like that, even saying that 10 years ago would have been like, what? You're crazy. Now it's a mainstay on the mainline, mainstream media. Like, this is how corrosive this is getting and how it's being accelerated very dramatically. But yes, there's positive benefit. There's a positive benefit too. Here, if I could just take one more minute. See, we've had a culture, sort of post-Descartes, and we could get into this more philosophically, that has really put an emphasis on subjectivity, right? And we are, and has oriented that way. But so it orients us towards the subjectivity, but robs us of our wisdom tradition, so we can't pursue Socratic self-knowledge. We just get continual self-indulgence, if I can put it that way. We constantly indulging ourselves in our biographies and things like that. What COVID is, it threw people back onto that subjectivity only to realize how shallow and fragile and non-resilient it was in the face of a very complex and often unpredictable world. And what that does for some people is it shatters them, but for other people they go, oh crap, I need to be this sounds sort of like a Hallmark card now, that's part of the problem, but I need to be a deeper self. I need to be, right, and and that doesn't mean just this way in egocentrically. Being a deeper self means this way out into the world, being more deeply connected to the world. So I think it has been a real kairos. It's been a bifurcation event for us. And how those are going to, I don't know. I feel like we're in a race between the cultivators of wisdom and the people who are beset by malevolent mythologies.
Yeah, speaking of malevolent mythologies, do you see the resorting to conspiracy and political extremes as the symptom of the displeasure?
Very much. I think it's a profound symptom of the meaning crisis. What we are trying to do. Look at the weird thing, right? Where in some ways we're all disaffected, and this even shows up in a lot of time in sort of voluntary disenfranchisement. We're completely disaffected with the political machinery. That's probably the only political consensus right now. We all think it's crap. It's not working well, right? And yet we, at the same time, are politicizing everything. We are raising politics to the level of a religion. I mean, many people, again, this, right? It's not just me who describe what's going on in the United States as a religious civil war between a Trump cult and the woke religion, right? And I'm not criticizing either one of those. I'm making an observation about the kind of entities they are, not what they're saying.
And I have to ask, have you seen, what was that documentary Netflix did on the way Facebook and Twitter and Instagram hack your attention?
Yeah, I forget, was it The Social Network or something? I can't remember. Yeah.
Yeah, when you have effectively attention-seeking platforms built to hack into your attention and grab you, do you see that as a cause of the kind of dissatisfaction and crisis of meaning? Or a totally separate thing?
Yeah, all these things fit together. I mean, in sort of almost a malevolent hyper-object, right? Because politics looks for combative narrative. That's how it thrives, because I can win in politics if I can somehow convince you that you and I are in this narrative struggle where we're the good people facing some enemy. And so and then the search algorithms figured out, wait, we can get attention within that cultural sphere if we pit people in an adversarial zero-sum game, and we antagonize them, and we will reward outrageous expressions of anger, and we will not reward sort of calm, deliberate, nuanced reflection. So, and what it also does, think about this, is it hijacks, right? One of the reality tests we have is we use other people's perspectives. Because one of the best ways for me getting out of my egocentric bias is to be tugged by yours, and we pull against each other and we can free ourselves. But, right, that gets hijacked by a pseudokind, because in the internet what I can do is look for lots of these connections of people who agree with me, and it looks like I'm tapping into the reality checking, while at the same time just feeding and reinforcing the bias. So all of this stuff, like all of these things are doing like this. And then what happens is people have an incoherent sort of global sense of how confusing all of this is, but how like chaotic it is. And so it drives them even further to seek the magic bullet conspiracy.
Mate, I'm giggling because in my notes prepping for this, I wrote, ask John about the type of bullshit he describes as going on in the world. And I think, yeah, I don't think somehow I need to ask her anymore. I mean, these things are cycles, right? It's cycles within cycles, and they clearly feed each other. Like the politicization clearly feeds the conspiracy, which then feeds the need and the desirability of the algorithms that are going to throw up things that make you angry, etc., etc. And I just wanted to throw something at Mark for a second. Because in this wave of bullshit and symptoms we're talking about, there's the opioid crisis. And the opioid crisis is sometimes colloquially described as a crisis of meaning, which might not mean that it's specifically this, but it sort of sounds it. Mark, you've done research here, haven't you?
Yeah, exactly. Actually, John and I have talked about this quite a lot because we're collaborating on a few things right now. But exactly right. I mean, one of the conclusions that we had in a recent paper we wrote on addiction was that addiction is probably not just it's not an opioid crisis in terms of there's too many opioids in the market, but rather it's a kind of meaning breakdown that people have a kind of persistent suffering that they're not able to get out of for all the reasons John's expressing. You know, we have a multifaceted, dynamical system of suffering that is difficult to eject from. And if that goes on for too long, of course, we're going to turn to supplements that give us the sense that we're doing better, or that we've somehow gotten out of that tangled system. And that's one of the things that we propose in our paper, is that opioids are acting on the brain to communicate to the brain that suddenly it's done much better at getting a good grip on the meaningfulness in your environment. Of course, you're not. You're doing sort of the opposite. You're eroding the possibility of meaning in some way, and yet the brain feels as though it's getting a grip on the scene. So of course that's going to be a problem in a world where we feel like we can't get a good grip. Exactly.
Yeah, it's like a synthetic kind of success. You know, there's a famous rat experiment where you give the rat the choice of cocaine and food, and as soon as you introduce a friend into the picture, it chooses the food. That's now the wholesome reward system, so to speak, being online. But if you look at the people who are affected by the opioid crisis, it's people who are disenfranchised. It's a lot of middle-aged men in middle America who have had their sources of meaning and their sources of livelihoods pulled from under their feet in various ways. So in some ways, no shit, that then you turn to synthetic things like opioids to help bridge that gap.
Well, could I comment on this? Because I think Mark's excellent work. If this is not condescending, I'm super proud of Mark. He's a former student of mine, and I hope Mark takes that as a compliment.
No, I love this, John. I mean, again, you know, you were my favorite professor, and you're a big reason why I continue to do academia, as I've said before. It's true.
So I think Mark's excellent work lines up with another Mark, who's a friend of mine, Mark Lewis. And Mark Lewis has proposed the reciprocal narrowing model of addiction. He's trying to replace the disease model, where you have a substance in you, it diseases you, and then that sort of cycles. And what our Mark here has said jives perfectly with Mark Lewis. I know Mark; he's a friend, and Mark Lewis proposes this kind of thing. So, as our Mark said, right? there's this kind of craziness, and then you take the substance and it alleviates that, and it gives you the sense that you're gripping the world. But in fact, you're not. What actually happens is your cognitive flexibility decreases, right? Now, as your cognitive flexibility decreases, your options in the world decrease. That makes the world more threatening. You internalize that as a more threatening world. You take more of the substance, and then your cognitive flexibility goes down. The options in the world, and then what it does is it reciprocally narrows to, as an agent, I can't be any other than I am, and the world can't be any other than it is, and then I'm trapped in this compulsion. So this is the reciprocal narrowing model, and that's a very, and there's a proper sense of the word, that's a very existential model of addiction, because it's the agent-arena relationship, right, and the way they are co-defining that's driving the addiction. But here's the thing. When I was talking to, I was literally at lunch with Mark Lewis, and I said, but, Mark, you have the reciprocal narrowing, but that means that the opposite is possible, what Plato talked about, the reciprocal opening, where you can open up the world and yourself in this mutually reinforcing fashion. And he went, and, right, part of what we need to do is not only reduce our being sucked into the black hole of reciprocal narrowing, we need to remember how to scaffold the reciprocal opening if we want to respond to the meaning crisis.
And is that what you mean when you say parasitic mental processing plays a role?
Very much, very much. So the idea is, like, so your most adaptive feature is that you're this evolving, self-organizing thing, like coupled to the world in this dynamic fashion. And what you have is, like, you can think about it, you have lots of like little machines, if I can use that metaphor. It's not quite right, but it's the closest one, for helping us avoid this explosion of information. Like, for example, you can't actually use formal probability and calculate the probability of most real-world events, because trying to calculate that probability would take you the rest of the history of the universe kind of thing. There's just too much, right? And so we don't do that. What we tend to do is we tend to use ways of biasing our attention that work a lot of the time. So here, let me give you just two examples, right? So what you tend to do is you tend to judge the probability of an event by how easily you can imagine it happening or how easily you can remember it happening. Or you tend to judge how probable an event is by sort of how prototypical it is in the category, right? So, and this is my favorite example, although COVID puts a bit of a crimp in it right now, but because we all do this, including me. You take your loved one to the airport, and, right, and you imagine big heavy metal falling from the sky with your Homo erectus brain. So, oh no, big heavy metal thing falling from the sky. And then when a plane crashes, how do they label it? They label it a disaster, a tragedy. So the probability of this goes like this. And these now reinforce each other. And you remember, right, what it's like to feel anxious. And so you say all the euphemisms to them, like, they're all euphemisms for don't die. It's like, tell me when you get there, right, a safe trip, as if this is going to make any difference whatsoever. And of course, you do that, and then you do this. You turn around, and you get, without a second thought, into the North American death machine called the automobile. And you don't pay any attention to that whatsoever. See, these individually adaptive things self-organize, and they can become very complex in anxiety and depression. And here's the important message. This is why I talked about ecology of practice. When you have a very complex system built out of adaptive machinery, if you try to destroy it, it adapts, it resists, it reconfigures itself. So this is why when you're in these things, you know you shouldn't be doing this, but you keep doing it. And the only way you can deal with a complex dynamical system like that is with a dynamic, self-organizing system of practices that can deal with it dynamically in parallel. That's what I mean by an ecology of practices.
Wow. I just have to say, I feel so sorry for soft little humans after this discussion. Like, we evolved all of these meaning-making machineries over a long period of time, and now they're going totally berserk. Like, it's good that we pay attention to what other people think if we're in a small tribal situation. We should update our models relative to what lots of other people think so that we can level out our biases. But then put that on a huge worldwide scale, and it goes nuts. Now we're believing whatever. You can just say, oh, the earth is flat, and you can look online and you can find a community that reinforces your weird belief. But you can do that with any kind of belief. Or, like you've just said now, like the emotional system was built so that, in part, big emotional experience cut deep, because they're going to be important for us one way or another. That big emotional experience is important for us. And I can imagine a time on the savannah where that would be a totally optimal system. But then get into a place where news is highlighting some stories, and they're the stories that you look at so that, you know, they can be earning money, and reducing other stories, and you're just going to find an optimal way of just bending our model completely out of shape. Poor humans. That's hard. I mean, and you say that we have to build a dynamical system that counteracts that dynamical system. That's a serious endeavor, and it's going to be a complicated endeavor, isn't it?
It is. It's very. Thank you for saying that, Mark. That's very well said. You know, I mean, I used to have one life. Well, I mean, other than my personal life, where I was an academic and I did research, I do science, right? And you know, and you and I, Mark, we're still doing that, and I love that. But then I got this second life where I'm doing, you know, trying to address and ameliorate, right, the meaning crisis. And so I have this online, right? But now I have this third life, which is I am in communication with these emerging communities of practice where people are trying to build ecologies of practices and supporting communities and then networking the communities together. So I'm involved in this community building, networking, right, thing too, because it's exactly what you said. That I don't know, that engineering project of putting these ecologies of practices together and then putting practitioners together within, a reciprocally opening community, and then getting those communities into network, like that is also a really hard problem.
It feels like this is layered. So what I mean by that is, if you're 10 years old and you have an experience with a pot of boiling water, you might reasonably at 13 stay away from the boiling water. But what we're talking about here isn't local experiences experienced by this particular human. We're talking about a deep set of expectations that humans seem to have baked in. So Mark, you mentioned the savannah. You know, our experiences on some level in the savannah seem to still be playing out today. John, is that sort of correct?
I think so. And here's, now I'll say something that is often deliberately, it's deliberately intended to be provoking. The thing what we've done when we've created these cultures of communities with ecologies of practices for transforming individuals and cultures in a reciprocally, related manner, right? That's religion. That's what religion is. I mean, Clifford Geertz's model of religion as basically this meta-meaning system. It's engineering all of this framework so that agent arena relationships are stably realizable by its members. This sounds paradoxical, but it's actually quite profound. Religion in and of itself isn't meaningful. It is the ground that makes all other meaning systems possible for us. And the problem for us, and this is part of what the meaning crisis says, and I'm not proselytizing here. Neither am I the village atheist, right? I'm not doing either one of those. The point I'm making for us, the problem we're facing, and you see this in the nones, the NONES, no religion, is we don't have, for many people, the existing religions don't form a viable place for people, right? Like two reasons why people are nuns. Not because they're necessarily scientific or rational, but they have a sense that the current religions are out of touch with the scientific worldview, and a sense, and their main reason is that they don't feel like they belong in these institutions. It's a connectedness issue. So we need something like religion to address this problem, and yet for most of us, the existing religions are no longer viable. All kinds of historical, scientific, and also, as I said, these kinds of cultural reasons. That's another way of saying what the meaning crisis is. We desperately need the functionality of religion, and we are desperately terrified of moving to that place. And when we tried the secular alternatives to religion, the pseudo-religious ideologies, communism and fascism and Nazism, because Nazism is not just fascism, by the way. Nazism is much more a religion than a political system, right? We drench the world in blood. We are traumatized from that. And so we've sort of like trapped. I can't go to religion. The secular alternatives don't work, but I can't live without. That's another way of talking about the meaning crisis.
And what bit about religion is providing the good there? Is it the ethical framework, or is it the community that is implied?
So those are the two things that, and sorry, I don't mean to be harsh with you. Those are the two things sort of the liberal mainstream media want to say. Religion's about being ethical because that's all that we really care about right now. And religion's about sort of getting together and forming communities. Even though we are liberal Democrats and we think individualism is a great thing and we mumble and mumble and mumble. No, I would say the functionality of religion is much more important than that. I wouldn't deny that those are important. But, you know, Susan Wolf in her book on meaning in life and why it matters, she makes a very powerful set of arguments that you can't reduce meaning to morality. You can't also, the reverse is also the case. You can't reduce morality to meaning, right? And then there's a third thing, and they all start with M. We need morality, because basically what morality is supposed to get is our commitment to being meaning makers. That's ultimately what morality is. It's about, you know, producing, protecting, and promoting meaning makers. But that's not meaning making. We independently need meaning making, and we also have to have a sense of mastery. I don't mean in the political sense. I mean in the sense of that, like Mark said, that ability to get an optimal grip on our world and ourselves. And those three, each one, they're like a trinity. You can't reduce any of them to the others, but they form a manifold. And religion addressed all three of those and said, when it's working, and let's not compare malfunctioning religion to good science any more than we should compare bad science to good religion. Let's stop doing that. That's ridiculous. But when religion is working, what it's doing is saying, I'm going to give you an ecology of practices so that you can wisely pursue morality, mastery, and meaning in a coherent, integrated fashion. That's religion.
No wonder we're getting, sorry, Jamie, no wonder we're getting movements like wisdom at the heart of Christianity today, like Richard Rohr and the Center for Action and Contemplation, where you have a big and increasingly popular movement that looks at Christianity not as just a certain dictate of what to do, but rather as an ecology of practices that were meant to help you transform your worldview so that you could fit better in the world that we have on tap.
Yeah, and Cynthia Bourgeault, you know, the wisdom way of knowing, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, this, you know, and it's interesting. It's interesting when you see Christians that are following that tradition, how they are capable of a kind of interfaith communing that you couldn't get at the doctrinal level. And that again, that's another way of talking about the meaning crisis. We get locked into propositional knowing. We forget the other kinds of knowing, and the other kinds of knowing is where most of the meaning making is happening. That's another way of talking about it.
So there's something happening here, and I know Jamie was hoping we would talk about this, so this might be a good transition. But we keep touching on this point about freezing and about fluidity, about locking down into a view and then being open and changeable, and then the resilience and the sort of anti-fragility that comes with that flexibility. That seems like it seems like it's core to this idea of meaning, this avoiding being locked and being willing to be open and flexible. And I know you've got quite a lot of work on flow, and I think we'd like to talk about that as well, if it was possible.
Well, yeah, I would have, but let me pick up on just that, and let's use sort of, you know, the developmental machinery given to us by Piaget, talking about that, because you could get the opposite too. And I know you're not meaning that, Mark. You could just open, and if you open to the point where you destroy yourself, that's horror.
Yeah,
That's horror, right? And so if you think about the sacred, the numinous, think about what it does, right? In one sense, it homes you in the world, right? And we talked about that, about it creates this meta-meaning system that prevents you from absurdity and horror. But the numinous also takes you to the horizon, right? So it's another way of thinking about it is it gives you sort of the meta-assimilation of home, a good religious system, but it also gives you, right, the meta-accommodation of taking you to the horizon of horror. Like when you meet God, it's terrifying, it's overwhelming, it's the mysterious tremendum, right, that Otto talked about. And so what you're doing is you're getting kind of this grand scale, both individually and collectively, equilibration that's very analogous, I would argue, to what Plato's talking about. And our sense of the sacred pulls on both of those. That's why you get and you can make each one of these a little bit ridiculous. If I just home, you get this sort of hallmark vision of the sacred as we all love each other and we're all at home. Or I can take you to a really good horror movie where I just give you, and notice how horror movies are filled with the sacred but they're filled with the terrifying, threatening aspect of it, right? And so I think what that is it's a set of constraints, enabling and selective constraints that, as you said, keep us in constant development, keep us constantly from locking down into either one of these, right? We can lock down, we can also lock open, and that's a problem. And what instead we want is, and the term, and you got it from Merleau-Ponty as well as I did, we're looking for an optimal grip. We're looking for that kind of thing. Like, again, when I'm looking at an object, there is no one right place. Sometimes I need the detail, sometimes I need far out, sometimes I need this angle, and I'm constantly trading off between all of these opposing viewpoints in order to get what is optimal for the task at hand, what's relevant. And I think, right, the sacred is about trying to give us that at the level of our worldview when it works properly. But of course it's not. I mean, Peter Berger was saying this in the late 60s. We've lost the sacred canopy. And again, look, this is what you can put on my tombstone. Neither nostalgia nor utopia. I'm not proposing we go back, and I'm not proposing, here's the utopic vision of how we can create. In fact, that would go exactly against what I was just saying to you, Mark, right? The disaster to development is to say, I'm done. Right?
I like Pema Chodron. Pema Chodron says that enlightenment is just being thrown from the nest again and again and again. So if you think enlightenment is an end stage thing, you've made a mistake. It is
exactly.
Change again.
Exactly. There was a notion in Eastern Orthodox Christianity, which is much more Neoplatonic, that we sort of lost in the Western heritage. They have epictasis, which is, so we have, the Western idea is you sort of go to heaven and you're sort of in sort of perpetual leisure or something, rest, right? The notion of epictasis is, no. What God is a continually affording scaffolding field for the ongoing self-transcendence of human beings. And that never stops. That's, right? That's the kind of model we need, I think, now. Because I think things are, like, we need models that deal with what has now become its own kind of pressing problem on us, which is the rate of change we are facing. So we can't seek rest. We can't seek cognitive closure or resolution. We have to seek a sacredness that constantly evolves our adaptivity. Like in biology, they are talking about, and it's so many things are helpful. Like we have traditionally talked about the evolution of traits, but they are now talking about the evolution of the metatrait, the evolution of evolvability itself, and that certain organisms have an advantage because they're more evolvable than other species, right? And so what I'm saying is we need to move from thinking of sacredness as the evolution of a trait to thinking of it as the evolution of our evolvability.
It's a meta trait, isn't it?
Yes.
It's metacognition rather than any particular kind of cognition. It's not about thinking this one thing. It's about getting better at being a thinker. It's not about feeling one thing. It's about getting better at being a feeler. Yeah, metacognitive.
That's well put. When we did the wisdom consensus paper, like Igor Grossman and Michel Ferrari and just a whole bunch of us, we got all the research people together. One of the consensus points we came to is that the core feature of wisdom is a meta-perspectival ability.
Yeah.
Well, then, to the degree that the American political climate is any indication of our adaptability and our non-dogmaticness, this becomes a miserable conclusion fairly quickly.
It does if you think that what is presupposed by that political structure is true. And what's presupposed by that political structure is that your cognition is through and through propositional, and that I can capture all of you by knowing your beliefs. And I would argue, and this is part of what is called 4E cognitive science, is that most of your knowing is done procedurally, perspectively and in terms of what I call participatory knowing. And therefore, a lot of your behavior is not driven by like propositional beliefs. Like a lot of your behavior is driven by your skills. A lot of your behavior is driven by your states of mind. A lot of behavior is driven by your identity structure, right? And these are things that are much more profound in meaning making. But if we stay up on the level of propositions, we're doomed. I agree. And that's where the American system has now collapsed to.
Exactly. So then how do we build that flexibility into our ecosystems?
So,
Yeah. What's the practice? Yeah, where does rubber hit the road here?
well, so first of all, I grew up, I'm much older than both of you. So there was a group in the 80s called The Police. You probably don't know. But they had a great song called Spirits in the Material World, which seems really appropriate for what we're talking about now. And the first line is kind of like an anthem for me. There is no political solution, in that the way things are structured now, zero-sum game. Look, democracy was supposed to be a model of opponent processing, where all parties committed to the process because all parties agreed that they were capable of self-deception and they needed each other for self-correction. And that's how it's supposed to work. And it's gone from opponent processing to zero-sum adversarial, right, defeat, right? The love of wisdom has been replaced by the love of victory, as Plato would put it, right? And so there's no way of making that machinery work to solve it. So I talk about stealing the culture. That's why I'm trying to emulate what Christianity did in the Roman Empire. They didn't propose and they didn't engage in a political revolution. They didn't propose a new economic system. They built communities of practices and communities of communities until an attractive way of life was available to people and people turned towards it. That's, I think, how we have to do this.
Yeah, and as soon as there's a winner and a loser in this game, there's no room for that flexibility.
No, exactly. That's what I mean. The flexibility, extremely well put. The flexibility is necessary, is negated by the presuppositions of the mode of communication and discourse of our political system. Exactly. You said it better than I did.
And you could say the same about the overemphasis on propositional knowledge.
Yes, very much. The same thing. And you see, and this is, again, Mark's work on the role of affect and how it's dynamically embodied and how much that is affecting our attention and our consciousness way before we get to the level of our propositional belief formation. That's a clear example of the kind of thing I'm talking about, right? Just getting and here's how we have to be, because as soon as I say that, people go, oh, emotion, and then romanticism kicks in, and we have all this bullshit about emotions and romanticism and how they're the antithesis of reason and all this crap that puts everything into adversarial conflict, the romantics versus the rationalists, and reason versus the people, and then we're lost. And and I don't want to put words in his mouth, but Mark's not saying, in fact, he's trying to break beyond that. He's trying, part of what his work says, it says a lot, but correct me if I'm wrong, Mark, but part of what your work says is, look, no, affect and what we call reason and what we call consciousness, they're all interpenetrating each other in an extremely complex and dynamic fashion.
Exactly right. And I mean, I just think it's beautiful that as our science progresses, we're seeing that our old way of thinking about the brain and thinking about systems as divorced from one another is breaking down, because we see that actually all these systems are so highly interdependent. Exactly right.
Yeah.
How would I go about practically developing this meta trait of flexibility and the opening up so I can get sort of correct grip, so to speak?
So, I mean, again, that's about like 10 episodes of the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. The basic idea is, first of all, you need cutting edge cognitive science. I'm not saying you have to be a cognitive scientist. What I'm saying is, look at sort of what I call the perennial problems. People confront absurdity, they confront alienation, they confront self-deception, parasitic processing. Learn about this. Then what you want is you want to pick up practices that have been designed and vetted by tradition or by science. These address this, right? These address this. So mindfulness really helps us break out of locking in or locking out, right? We lock in and lock out, and mindfulness practices return us to that, that dynamic of assimilation and accommodation so we can re-optimally grip. At least that's what I would argue mindfulness practices do, and there's lots of explanation. The problem with mindfulness practices, here's what I want to say is no one practices a panacea. So mindfulness practices enhance your capacity for insight. That's great. When we like it, we call it insight. When we use those practices and we don't like it, we call it jumping to a conclusion. It's the same machinery. But it's like when we like it, it's a heuristic, and we don't like it, it's a bias, right? And so when we need to not jump to conclusions, sometimes we need insight. But sometimes we need the opposite. We need the careful step-by-step building of evidence and argument to come to conclusion, and we don't want to jump to conclusion. So you need other practices, for example, like active open-mindedness, that hold off that insight machinery and make us go step by step through. And if you notice, they're like opponent processing. Think what you do in meditation. You shut off all that propositional inferential thinking so that the insight machinery can come to the fore. In active open-mindedness, you do the opposite. You try to really damp down that insight machinery so the inferential propositional machinery can carefully unfold. And so what you want to do is you want to find practices that do that are an opponent processing, that mutually correct each other. So you want ones that are vetted for addressing the perennial problems. You want so that they can constellate into opponent processing. You want them to layer on top of each other. So you can take a meditation practice, a contemplation practice, and a flow practice like Tai Chi Chuan, and you can integrate them all together so you can realize what's called prajna, which is kind of this flowing inward and outwardness of attention in a parallel simultaneous fashion. And then you also want to have bridging practices that bridge between propositional processing and perspectival processing, like Lectio Divina. So you want to build your process as well. But you want to have a meta practice within the community that constantly evolves how you coordinate and curate your ecology of practices. And that's where dialectic into dialogos works. That's my proposal. And once you get that going, you have communities, and then you network the communities together.
Yeah, so you really need other people for this process, because part of that is being able to overcome your own biases and blind spots as you build a sort of dynamical approach to understanding.
Well, but this is the point. In my friend Greg Enriquez, and also the work of Sperber and Mercier, although I have a lot of criticisms of their book, The Enigma of Reason. But the idea that we work best, it's funny, we work both best and worst in distributed cognition. And that most of when you said we work, we need other people, that's the case for almost, look, I didn't invent English, you didn't invent English, I'm not running the electric grid, I didn't produce these machines, these screens, and it's like all of this is like, that's all distributed cognition. And, from Ed Hutchins on, we've learned to really realize that distributed cognition is where most of our problem solving happens. So you take Plato's metaphor of the ship of state, right? And then you put Ed Hutchins in it. He did the cognition in the wild. He did the ethnography. Who navigates a ship? No one. It's a bunch of people and a bunch of instruments that form a dynamical system that navigate a ship. And Dan Chiappi and I have done the same thing with who moves the rovers around on Mars? No one person. It's a bunch of scientists, a bunch of machines, and the rovers forming a dynamical system that get the rovers to explore Mars. That's how we do everything. Everything good, at least.
Not to be meta about the meta trait, but I asked the question, what do you do? And you say, well, it's not just this one thing, right? You kind of need to stay flexible even in your approach to building the flexibility.
Yep. Well, yeah, but then what you do is I understand your point, but this isn't sort of an individual thing. That's what I'm trying to get. You're not sort of sitting back and saying, like, so for example, when you do like things like circling, or what I call dialectic, or what I'm building with Guy Senstock, Chris Mitro, dialectic into dialogos. But even in circling, which is one of the sub practices of it, like this amazing things happen. So basically what happens in circling is you get into a distributed flow state. You're not just getting into a flow state because between you and the environment, like the rock climber, the environment is other people, and so you're all scaffolding each other into a sort of a meta flow state. Everybody's flowing and they're all flowing together. And then what happens, first of all, is people rediscover that connectedness. And how they almost always put it is this incredible intimacy, and it's neither right economic nor sexual intimacy. It's this other kind of intimacy. And they say things like, I've always wanted this, but I didn't know, which is really interesting. It's like Plato's, we're always just remembering, right? So they get that. But then you get a next stage. What people realize, they start to sense an intimacy with the dynamical system, the collective intelligence that has being expressed and developed within the distributed cognition. And you feel it, like I call it the logos from Greece, dialogos, right? But people from all backgrounds, religious and not, start to talk about it like a spirit. They start to talk about it with religious and sacred language. So it's not just, I'm going to be more flexible. This practice gives you access to look, the internet gives us the power of collective computation. Dialogos gives us the power of collective intelligence, right? And that's what culture really helps us do. That is what I'm talking about as being the thing that ultimately is the forum, the arena in which we are guided. I don't know if that answered your question, but that's how I'm trying to answer it.
No, that answers my question absolutely, and it just made me think of the Marines. This is effectively what they're trying to build with Marines. The groups of 6 or 7.
Yep.
Is there something that like?
It is, except I would make a distinction, and and I'm talking with Tim Bishop a lot. He came out of the military, but now he's doing is he's building a system, a lot of based on my work by his own admission, right, where he basically goes into businesses, and instead of doing all the typical thing you do when a business is in trouble, bottom line, new technology, blah, blah, he goes in and says, no, your culture is messed up. How do we fix your culture? And how do we get everybody in culture so they're working as a culture again? And he's having massive success with that, right? And so the thing about the military is Durkheim made a distinction between mechanical solidarity, in which you get people like in sync by trying to get them as homogeneously the same as possible, right? Or you do what he called the division of labor. What you do is you have a very complex system that is capable of complexifying itself. So it's both highly diverse and highly integrated, and it's dynamically complexifying itself. And the thing about that, and the military tries to get both of those, and that's the difficult problem. And I'm actually proposing the second. The second is what happens in Dialogos. You don't realize, hey, we're all the same and kumbaya. What you get is, wow, that person is really mysterious to me, and yet I'm intimately connected to them, and their mystery calls to my mystery, and I didn't realize this about me, and we co-emerge together.
At the risk of totally missing the point in this being a comparison that doesn't work at all, the language you're using here is often the language people use around taking synthetic drugs like MDMA or ecstasy.
Yep.
Is that the same mechanic?
So, I think Aidan Lyon is right that we shouldn't reduce psychedelic experience. He's written the book. He's literally written the book, The Psychedelic Experience. It should be coming out, and I've had a conversation with him. I don't think we should reduce psychedelic experiences, which are mind-revealing experiences, just to the ingestion of substance. You can also do it through practices, mindfulness practices, flow practices, ritual practices, and you have to be really, really careful. And this is some of the empirical work I did. We did work on what's the relationship between like mystical experiences, which aren't the same as psychedelic. Mystical experiences are a subset of psychedelic experiences, and transformative experiences are a subset of mystical experiences. But anyways, what makes these experiences transformative for people is not the phenomenological content, not the what you see is it's actually the insight machinery, what we've been talking about all the way through here, that's doing all the heavy lifting. So if I were to simplify it, it's not the what of your experience, it's the how. And what it looks like, this is kind of an oversimplification. I want to say too, so neural networks have a problem because they're so good at pattern detection. That's their great strength is their great weakness. Just like I've been saying, right? They overfit, right? They overfit. So whatever limited sample you give, they find patterns in that sample, and they're so good at it, they find all kinds of patterns that don't generalize to the population. That's called overfitting to the data, and there's no escape from that, because the only way to escape from that, like, it would be to sample everything, and you can't do that. So what you do as an approximation, as a heuristic, is you periodically throw noise into that network, and it bounces it, it sort of scatters it, and what you're relying on isn't any inferential computational manipulation. What you're doing is basically breaking the system and relying on its capacity to re-self-organize that drives the development, right? And that is kind of like what psychedelics are doing. And if you look across the traditions, wisdom traditions use all kinds of disruptive strategies like that: sleep deprivation, sex deprivation, sensory deprivation, food deprivation. We do all kinds of to do that, to throw that noise into the system. Now, what's really interesting about that is, and I actually said this when I was in the middle of a circling practice. I was saying, so I got to be careful. This was a long time ago, the one thing I'm referring to. The other recently happened. In the circling, I said, wow, this reminded me what happened when I took magic mushrooms. Because what's happening when you look at the psychedelic is areas of the brain that are not normally talking to each other are talking to each other. That's the noise and the triggering. And when you're doing circling, you get, because you're internalizing all these different and weird perspectives, areas of the, this is my hypothesis, areas of the brain are talking to each other that are not normally talking to each other, and that's why you start to trip out. But the difference is you don't have all this toxic shit in your system, and so you can actually, remember it properly and do all this other stuff. So I don't think we should be prohibiting psychedelics to adults. Children's a different thing. But on the other hand, I think people should be really properly educated, and that you should, if you're taking a psychedelic, it should be taken within a sapiential context. You should have lots of practices that are helping you train against self-deception, and you should have lots of dialogical practices that are getting you out of your own ego prison, or else there's a really good chance that the psychedelic experience will just bullshit you. You'll just bullshit yourself into some narcissistic thing.
Yeah, and the thing is, when you think about in pop culture, psychedelics or MDMA, it's the phenomenology that's where the emphasis is. Nothing to do with the mechanics, and the mechanics are clearly the revealing thing.
If we do not, so Evan Thompson, my friend and great colleague, one of the godfathers, of 4E cognitive science, right? Always keep the phenomenology and the functionality together. You need both. Don't just do the functionality. That's to miss the phenomenology. Don't just do the phenomenology, right? That's why, you want the two. You're doing good work when you can link the two together without reducing one to the other, where you get like a reciprocal reconstruction between them. That's what we need. That's what we need, I would argue.
Mark, is there anything to add?
No, I think that's lovely. What a powerful discussion, and I think we have lots to chew. We have lots of food for thought, and I just want to reflect one more time. I think this is a sober spirituality you're discussing here, John. It's scientifically based, but it's not reductive to science. It's layered, it's complex, it requires others. It's not a quick fix, nor do I think it should be a quick fix. And there is no poles. It's always between the polarity, which makes it much more complicated, but I think it makes it much more true. Because I am always very suspicious of anyone who says, practice like this and it'll get better. That's only, context is king, isn't it?
Yeah.
It has to be for you. We said this earlier in another episode, but if you're the kind of person who obsesses, then mindfulness of trauma can be a problem. It's better if you're somebody who avoids to be asked to look at. But if you're somebody who obsesses, being asked to look at is a problem. So context is king. And I appreciate the complex, practical approach that you've mentioned here.
Well, thank you, Mark. That means a lot to me coming from you. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
I like, and as I've said already in this podcast, I think your work is exemplary of the kind of 4E cognitive science that can contribute to the reciprocal reconstruction between science and spirituality that is desperately needed today in the meaning crisis. Very much.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, as an outsider to this research, it's just immensely refreshing to hear a kind of scientific spirituality that doesn't reduce, that isn't reductionist in any significant form.
Yeah.
And John, just before we finish up, where can everyone listening find you?
So, I mean, I have a bunch of series on YouTube. I have, I guess the cornerstone is Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, but I have an ongoing dialogue series called Voices with Vervaeke. I have a bunch of series on also on a playlist called The Cognitive Science Show. I've done Untangling the World Knot with Greg Enriquez, which is about consciousness. The Elusive I, which with Greg Enriquez and Christopher Mastropietro on the nature and function of the self. Towards a metapsychology that is true to transformation with Greg Enriquez and Zachary Stein, about trying to get a scientific framework that will afford the genuine transformation that is needed today. And there's a bunch more coming out right now, and so that's what I would recommend. If you go into any of those series, I make reference to all kinds of material, and you'll also get connections to my academic work.
Well, thank you for listening to the Contemplative Science Podcast. That was John Vervaeke, and as always, we'll see you next week.